Serial killers, born or made. Psychologists often debate whether our genetics or environmental factors play a bigger role in determining our behavior, physical characteristics, intelligence, and sociability. Some scholars believe that our DNA, or our nature, is the main deciding factor for our characteristics and personality, but other psychologists see that our environment and experiences, or our nurture, have more influence on these traits. Many studies have been conducted with twins and siblings to control these factors and find a possible answer, but no one side is correct. This argument can be applied to serial killers, people who commit a series of murders with no apparent motive and following a specific pattern of behavior. Are they born or made? Serial killer behavior can be primarily attributed to environmental factors. Humans are not born morally bad, but they can come to believe that murder and violent behavior is acceptable or justifiable depending on the people that raised them, the opportunities they received in adolescence, and other experiences that may foster psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies. A psychopath is defined as a person suffering with a chronic mental disorder with abnormal violent behavior, and a sociopath is a person with a personality disorder that causes extreme antisocial attitudes and a lack of conscience. Rodney Alcala, also known as the dating game killer, was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas, and moved to Mexico at a young age. While his family lived in Mexico, Alcala's father abandoned them, and his siblings and mother moved with him to Los Angeles shortly after. Just before adulthood, Alcala joined the Army, but he was discharged 4 years later after a major breakdown, leading to his diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Alcala had a mental health condition in which a person has a long-term pattern of manipulating and exploiting the rights of others. To get his life back on track, Alcala attended UCLA and received a fine arts degree in 1968, but he moved to New York after he attacked a young girl in California the same year. He enrolled in NYU under the name John Berger in an effort to escape the FBI's most wanted list. Soon enough, some girls at an arts camp recognized him, he was arrested, and Alcala was deemed a sex offender. In September 1978, Rodney Alcala appeared on The Dating Game, to which he attributes his nickname. He charmed a prospective date, Cheryl Bradshaw, introducing himself as, quote, a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the darkroom at the age of 13, fully developed. Although he wanted to date with her, she quickly realized his creepy nature and opted not to go. Alcala continued to exploit women on both the East and West Coast throughout the 1970s, and he was finally arrested in 1979 and sentenced to death in March 2010. He passed away in prison on July 24, 2021. Rodney Alcala violated and murdered women and girls in the 1970s. His persuasive and charming manner made him a good predator, convincing women that he was a fashion photographer. He would rape and strangle his victims, and he would commonly revive the women before killing them. He was also known to take pictures of his victims in sexually suggestive poses, alive and after death. Rodney Alcala's violent behavior began with his attack on Tali Shapiro in 1968. Thanks to a concerned witness, officers discovered the 8-year-old still alive after a beating from a steel bar, but Alcala was able to flee the scene just in time. During the 1970s, Alcala committed 9 known murders, but there could be many more uncovered. In fact, some authorities believe he could have taken anywhere from 50 to 130 lives. In New York City, he killed Cornelia Crilly and Ellen Hover. Crilly was raped and strangled in her apartment in 1971, and Hover's body was discovered following her disappearance in 1977. In addition to these crimes, Alcala abducted and murdered 12-year-old Robin Samso in Huntington Beach. Despite being convicted of these charges in 1980, the trial was overturned twice due to technicalities. Rodney Alcala was found guilty of Samso's death in 2010, along with 4 more stranglings that occurred in the late 1970s. Jill Barcombe, Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parenteau. Alcala's last 2 murders took place in 1977, Christine Ruth Thornton in Wyoming and Pamela Lamson in San Francisco. Shortly after his arrest in 1979, police discovered a storage locker of Alcala's in Seattle, which contained images of his victims along with a pair of gold earrings linked to Samso. Some of the photographs were explicit, and some identified surviving victims of Alcala who came forward about these terrible events. This case study proved my hypothesis that environmental factors are the root cause of a serial killer. Rodney Alcala's psychological problems were most likely a result of his childhood experiences. When he was around 8 years old, Alcala's family relocated to Mexico. This can be a very stressful experience, especially for an adolescent. Then, 3 years later, his father abandoned him and his family, which undoubtedly caused unresolvable trauma for Rodney. His father served as a model for mistreating women, which Alcala followed in his adulthood. He moved back to the U.S. with his mother and siblings and joined the Army at 17. He was discharged only a few years later after a mental breakdown and his diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Although his genetics most likely predisposed Alcala to this mental illness, his adolescent experiences exacerbated his disability, leading to his abnormal, manipulative, and violent behavior. This case study is, however, limited to just Rodney Alcala and his personal experiences. Some alternate explanations for serial killer include biological factors, psychodynamic factors, and evolutionary psychology. The theory of biological psychology believes that people's behavior can be explained by their genetics. Rodney Alcala's genes could have predisposed him to antisocial personality disorder or other sociopathic behaviors, which led to his future as a serial killer. Secondly, the psychodynamic approach of psychology, inspired by Sigmund Freud, focuses primarily on our unconscious desires that drive human behavior. It states that an adult's personality is often the result of childhood experiences. This perspective can be applied in explaining Rodney Alcala's motivation to be a serial killer, because it is probable that his childhood experience, including being abandoned by his father, made a significant impact on his personality and habits as an adult. He most likely had unconscious desires to hurt and exploit people, especially women. Lastly, the evolutionary theory of psychology could explain serial killer behavior. This theoretical perspective states that our behavior and mental mechanisms are a product of psychological adaptations that evolved to solve specific problems with survival or reproduction. Evolutionary psychologists could argue that Rodney Alcala's serial killer tendencies were a psychological adaptation. His serial killer tendencies were developed as a result of his childhood trauma.